This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
We discuss mental health with father and daughter psychologists Dr. Rick Spencer and Dr. Paige Spencer on this edition of Conversations. You hear it in the news: suicides, mass shootings, substance abuse. The list goes on. Why do these things seem so prevalent in today's world? Why is our mental health seemingly being neglected? On this edition of Conversations, we're joined by two psychologists with insights on the issues. Dr. Rick Spencer has doctorates in both clinical psychology and developmental psychology. He's been practicing for more than 3 decades. He does individual, family, and couples counseling. His expertise is often sought after in legal matters and court-ordered evaluations. He is a partner at Psychological Associates in Pensacola, Florida. Paige Spencer is a licensed psychologist with Psychological Associates in Pensacola. She received her doctorate in psychology from the Florida Institute of Technology. Dr. Spencer focuses on a variety of psychological disciplines, working with groups, families, and individuals, ranging from preteen to adult. We welcome Dr. Rick Spencer and Dr. Paige Spencer. I'm excited about this dynamic because we have father, daughter, male, female, young, not quite as young.
Right.
So it gives us kind of a whole different perspective on things. So welcome, both of you. I'm going to begin with you, Paige. Why did you decide to follow your father into the mental health business?
Well, growing up, I was always a daddy's girl, and I was very interested in what he did. And so I decided to take some psychology classes in college, and I just loved it. I was very interested in the dynamic of human behavior, thoughts, feelings, and what all impacted how people express themselves. And my dream was always to come back and work with him, which thankfully has become a reality.
Awesome.
And I didn't even know that. So, so that was really good for me. And I basically date myself. The 3 decades is because I came to Pensacola to practice here at Psychological Associates when Paige was 1 year old.
Wow.
So I've been here now 31 years in August.
Yeah. It must be extremely satisfying, though, for you to see her come back and work with you and actually doing something that is extremely valuable to our community and helping people.
Oh, it really is. It fills me with a great deal of pride.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that our society as a whole is facing. And as we tape this program, we can look back, and recently there have been some very high-profile people who have taken their own lives. Anthony Bourdain, the famous chef, Kate Spade, and Robin Williams, a handful of, I guess, a few years ago. What's going on? There seems like are there more suicides going on today, or is it we just hear more about it?
Well, there appears to be more suicides. We're looking at from 1999 to today, there's been a 30% increase. And there's different increases in certain age groups. With children, teens, there's a big increase. For white children, there's a 70% increase. Black children, which is still a smaller group, is 77%. Wow. Middle-aged men, between 45 and 64, I believe. I believe that's a 43% increase. So there's definitely an increase. The why is we don't know yet. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, and we can certainly talk about some of that tonight.
What are your thoughts on it, Paige?
Well, one area that has increased tremendously that I think is an increasing public health crisis is teens and young adult suicide. It's the third leading cause, suicide's the third leading cause of death from the age of 10 to 25. And those rates have increased, as he said, close to 30% in the last 20 years. I think that social media and the explosion of the internet has to do with that increase. Although social media, we would like to say that it's a way to connect with other people, with other friends, it's actually very socially isolating. And teens these days and young children will post things and maybe not get enough likes, and then they become depressed and more isolated. So I think children use social media as a way to connect with other people, but really it's replacing face-to-face interactions, and they're not getting that interpersonal connection that's so important to feel validated and accepted.
You said Age 10, you're seeing children that young who are taking their lives?
Yeah. 10 to 25, it's the third leading cause of death.
Wow, I had no idea that young was going on. Wow, that's amazing. You talk about the social media. I know one of the things that I had seen come out in the press after the Kate Spade and the Anthony Bourdain taking their lives was something copycat type situations. Is that what happens? Does suicide spike when you have these high profile type people take their lives? Do other people jump on the bandwagon who are maybe on the verge of it all of a sudden?
Well, I think one thing that happens, and Rick can talk more about this, my dad, but the media focuses so much on the negative aspects of suicide and everything that's gone wrong that it really affects the way that other people see that. And people that have suicidal thoughts or behaviors may think that that's the only way out. So I think with the recent events, the media has been guilty of focusing mostly on negatives without a lot of prevention and positive ways out for people, which can contribute to a copycat effect.
So we do think if we focus on the positive effect, how we identify, how we try to solve and help people, then that's certainly a better way of media to solve things. But there's actually something called the Whirter Effect, which has been around since the 1800s. And that was based on a book written by Goethe in the 1800s in Germany. And his book was called The Sorrows of Young Goethe. And it was a book that romanticized this man who had lost his love and he committed suicide. And after that book came out, there was a spike in suicides in Germany.
Really?
And since that time, that's what they call the Whirter Effect. And, we saw it after Marilyn Monroe committed suicide. You see it, we'll probably see a spike in at least an interest over the internet. For example, there is a series on Netflix called 13 Reasons, and it's about teen suicide. And after that came out, there was a 20% spike in interest on the internet about suicide, reported by Google. So whenever something like this happens, there is this kind of interest, and at times there can be a contagion. And a contagion could be somebody who's already having a suicidal idea, and now someone else did it, it's real, it's possible, I might could do it. So that's when we have to be more aware and try to give people ideas on how we can reach them. And I think it really is about reaching out and having human connection.
What are some of those ideas? How can we reach somebody who may be struggling?
Well, one thing that I did want to talk about is barriers to why people reach out. And I think a huge barrier is the mental health stigma that is still very prevalent in our country. To kind of illustrate that, I had an example of if you have a big work presentation that you're asked to give and you wake up that morning and you're sick. Would you feel more comfortable calling in and telling your boss that you had a kidney stone, or would you feel more comfortable calling in and telling him that you're having a spike in suicidal thoughts and depression and fatigue? And most people would probably say they would rather say the kidney stone, which just shows that our country is still very, very much stigmatizes mental health. But depression, mood disorders, schizophrenia, all of those have a brain dysfunction component as well, where areas of our brain that affect impulse control and emotional regulation are affected. So I think barriers to treatment is the stigma, and the way that we can overcome that is by talking about mental health, getting the word out there, and every person taking an individual responsibility to reach out and ask other people that are in their lives if they're having problems, or do you need to talk, or just say, I'm thinking about you, and encourage people to seek treatment when it becomes a clinical.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point too, is first off, we have to be aware. We have to kind of notice others, because those people that are close to those thoughts of suicide, they're going to be isolated at that moment. They're most likely in some level of despair and feeling hopeless, and they're going to be withdrawing. So I think it'd be good for us to talk about indicators.
Please do.
So first, if you know somebody who begins to just change in their personality, their mood, that's important. Anybody that begins to talk about death more often. Sometimes children, for example, might start engaging in some self-destructive behaviors, even young kids. I remember years back I worked at the Children's Stress Unit, literally, I guess, 25 years ago. And we would have some preschool to elementary school kids that before they came in, they might have just run into walls and done some very risky behavioral things that was self-destructive. So that type of thing, look at somebody who's having stress in their life, either legally, financially, anybody that's having at-risk behavior with substance abuse. There's just a host of different things that when you know somebody's in distress, but getting back to the whole stigma issue, it's less likely that we say, oh, gee, I understand that you're looking depressed these days.
Right, right.
So we have to find ways to reach out in maybe a different way and ask people if they're okay.
We hear the word depressed a lot, or depression a lot. What is the clinical definition of it? What is depression? I mean, I know what it is from, geez, I feel kind of depressed today or something like that, but in your world, what is it?
Well, we use the DSM-5 diagnostic manual for diagnosing mental health issues, which depression, major depressive disorder, is a group of behaviors and feelings that someone is reporting. And that can range from fatigue, insomnia, hypersomnia, persistent feelings of sadness, overeating, undereating, feeling hopeless, worthless, not having any drive for the future, anhedonia, or just feeling kind of blah, like an Eeyore type of a picture. And so typically we see that someone has to have experienced these symptoms for longer than a 2-week period of time. Right. And there's different levels, mild, moderate, or severe, depending on how it's affecting someone's day-to-day functioning.
Now, is this something that's chemically going on in the brain that's causing this, or is this just lifestyle, or both?
Probably both, but definitely there's a chemical process going on. We certainly recognize the care that psychiatrists and other medical physicians give when they treat major depressive disorder with antidepressant medications, which increase certain levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin and so forth, and you've probably heard of those on the television and so forth. So that definitely is a biochemical aspect of depression. And the depression that Paige is talking about is a pretty severe form that happens pretty quickly. We also see people with persistent depression, which can be going on at a low level for 2 years. But most of these people at some point have some type of death ideation or suicidal thoughts. As psychologists, we really hear about suicide all the time. It's not a rare thing. It might be at a very low level, and we look for that. We look for whether or not there is a high lethality rate, whether or not this person is at risk, and we're doing to put them in the hospital for their own safety. Most of the time, it's kind of a low-level death ideation. I just don't want to feel this way. I'm ready to do something different. It's more vague, and that's usually a relatively safe phenomenon. But if you were to go to the emergency room because you were having these kinds of thoughts, you'd most likely be admitted, maybe even Baker acted, which is involuntarily admitted for safety reasons. And then after an evaluation, you may only be there in a day, just to determine how you're doing and what your safety level is. But for the most part, again, people that are depressed have these kind of thoughts frequently.
I know a lot of people have to be asking this question. You take a look at, some of the celebrities, and Kate Spade or Robin Williams or Mr. Bourdain, and you would think on the outside looking in, they have it all. They've got money, they've got fame, they've got this, they've got that. So the question becomes, why would they take their life?
That's because we don't know what was going on in their lives. We don't know what was hidden behind the cameras or the face or the photographs. I would imagine that all three of those people had really significant issues going on. So I doubt there was just some kind of transient suicidal thought that they acted on.
Right.
And someone like Robin Williams, for what I've read recently, had developed a neurological disorder that I think he was afraid he was beginning to show symptoms of, and decided he didn't want to experience that.
Right, right.
You know, I think this idea that celebrities have it all and they don't experience mental health is just a complete myth. And with these recent suicides, it does show that you don't know what's going on with people, whether they're posting things on social media and they look like they're having fun. You just never know what's going on inside someone's head or in their lives. And even if everything looks perfect, really the way that we live, people may perceive things differently and perceive it in a very negative way and have feelings of hopelessness, low self-esteem, negative self-talk. And a lot of that can be hidden by cameras and fame and other things, but it could still be there.
Interestingly enough, I have an article here from the Wall Street Journal that's sort of talking about what's going on in the country today as far as that is concerned. And one of the areas that they talked about is seems to be a high occurrence in middle-aged white men. What's the story with that? Any indication of why?
I guess the simple answer is no. It's kind of a recent blip. I don't think you can necessarily say the typical financial stresses, even though I don't think wages have really increased that much. Right. But no, it's definitely a phenomenon that we're beginning to research and try to learn more of. Do you have any ideas about that?
Potentially trouble with transitions in life, pressures of having to support family, and just not being able to ask for help. I think with that age group and men in particular, there is especially a stigma. So they're not reaching out and talking about their problems. And so suicide seems like the only way out, that maybe their family's better off without them. That's a very distorted way of thinking.
And men in general are more likely to commit suicide. They're more successful. Women may try more, but men are more successful. Another thing we really haven't talked about, but is related to the mass shootings that we've seen, is that 50% of suicides are gun-related. And then if you look at the deaths of pertaining to guns, 64% of them are suicides. So, probably getting back to gun safety, and especially with teenagers, you want to make sure that the guns are locked up. You've got to keep that safe and do what you can to minimize any kind of incident.
Drifting off the suicide just for just a second here and talk about the mass shootings for a mention, because I mentioned that in the open of just some overall mental health situation. What do you make of these young people who are going into these schools? What's going on in their mind? I mean, I know you don't know specifically, but from a mental health standpoint, what's going wrong to cause them to do that?
My guess would be just severe emotional pain, probably trouble with the home family dynamic, and for whatever reason, they're trying to inflict pain on other people, and they believe that that's going to make them feel better.
Yeah, some type of alienation that they're experiencing. One thing that I've read actually recently is that most of those individuals had some obsession with the contagion about mass shootings. They went back to Columbine, and many of them read obsessive articles about them. So they began to, again, social media kind of began of an obsession. And we certainly know that any kind of acting out behavior, there's usually an obsession that precedes it. And so, we have to kind of look at what we've done to sensationalize mass shootings in a way, because there's so much interest. I mean, we're talking about it tonight.
Right.
But I think that is some kind of a piece of it.
You keep hearing people talk about, with the young people, the video games, and that they have grown up video games and shooting people or whatever, that at some level in their mind, they don't think it's reality because everything works out well in the video game, nobody seemingly gets hurt or whatever. Am I stretching there?
I think a little bit. There's been some research that's talked about if there's already a predisposition to violent behavior, or if they're witnessing violent behavior in their everyday lives, that video games may increase the risk of violence.
Right, and that moment is kind of like that sensitizes or excites that moment, versus it necessarily being a long-term situation. Go ahead.
Well, just in most, the typical kid that's playing video games that doesn't have other risk factors already in place, it's not going to then create a monster who's going to go out and shoot in their school.
Right. I mean, you wouldn't believe the kids today, they all watch video games.
Sure.
And they all want to be video game makers.
Right.
So, that's the employment choice.
So when we hear that tossed around from time to time, you know, because I mean, I've heard that numerous times. These video games are causing the kids, you know, and so you don't put a whole lot of faith in that.
I remember 35 years ago when I was in graduate school that there was the violent TV, and there was plenty of research on it then, and it was the same conclusion that it really kind of excites them in the moment and maybe increase their level of potential acting out violence, you know, within that time period, but not necessarily going to create a violent person.
Interesting. And it's interesting you bring that up, because I do remember the whole violence on TV debate.
Yeah,
back
it's the same thing.
Yeah, back in the day. Talk a little bit about, one of the things that I've also read is schizophrenia can, I guess, be an indicator perhaps. Are people who are schizophrenic more likely to commit suicide?
I don't know if I have the data on that. I would probably venture to guess yes. But you know, we're talking about a totally different disorder, one that has a psychotic component to it, and more likely a psychotic component most of the time, which means they're outside of the bounds of reality. They may be living within a delusional system, which could be, you know, grandiose or paranoid. They may have hallucinations, usually auditory, sometimes visual. Probably more than that, we may see a different kind of psychotic condition with a different disorder, like bipolar disorder, for example. Right. You become manic, and that mania can become elevated to a very psychotic level.
I hear the term bipolar an awful lot. So explain to me exactly what is it?
Well, bipolar disorder is a category of a mood disorder, which combines having to have a major depressive episode, so all of the criteria that we listed earlier with the sadness, potential suicidal thoughts, but it also has a piece where someone has to experience a mania, and what we define as mania is, again, a group of behaviors where someone is experiencing high energy levels, increased goal-directed behavior, pressured speech, racing thoughts. They may have so much energy that they stay up for 4 to 7 days without needing any sleep. They might engage in increased risk behaviors, sexual promiscuity, excessive spending, and there's a flare of grandiosity, so kind of feeling like they're on top of the world, they can't be touched. But it's all of those behaviors are within about a 2-week period of time, 1 to 2 week period of time, without any breaks. And you can have a hypomanic episode where it's kind of mixed, or it's not as intense. But for bipolar disorder, you're swinging between a manic episode and a depressive episode.
So in the old days, when somebody used to use a loose language, he's crazy, now they say they're bipolar. So those are just unfortunate turns of the phrase.
And how is that controlled? Because I hear people say, well, he's bipolar, but he takes medicine for it, or he doesn't take medicine for it, whatever the case may be.
Well, there's medication. There's medication for the mania side as well as the depression side. And for people that take their medication, it's well controlled. Right. But they still live with a very stressful scenario of mood shifts and occasional feelings of unexplainable irritation or rage. So it's a very difficult scenario to live with, and most of those people seek some type of supportive psychotherapy as well to deal with everyday life.
Interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead, Paige.
I was just going to mention, you were asking about schizophrenia earlier, and what the American Psychological Association research actually shows is that suicide's more closely related to disorders like bipolar disorder, depression, and substance and alcohol use disorders, more so than schizophrenia.
I have about 3 minutes. You know, we often talk about our physical health and the things that we can do in order to keep ourselves in great physical condition. Exercise, eat well, yeah, everybody knows the story. What can we do to keep ourselves in great mental condition?
Well, it's looking at what's preventative. And when we look at what's preventative of suicide, it's human connection. It's association with other people, could be groups. If you have a substance use disorder, you may be in an AA group or an NA group. It's access or allowing yourself access to mental health. It's being involved in your church. It's all kinds of different ways to stay connected to others. Because remember, when you're feeling suicidal, you're isolated, you're depressed, you're alone. And so human connection and whatever facilitates that, in my mind, is one of the best preventative factors to augment your mental health.
I think it's also worthy to note that the physical health recommendations are also for mental health.
Right.
Exercise, healthy diet, getting out in the sun, being active, having hobbies, those are all also ways to treat depression and anxiety.
What advice would you give, because I know you work a lot with teens and young people, what advice would you give to parents? What should parents be watching out for?
They should definitely be watching out for their children to start socially isolating, pulling back, sleeping more, sleeping less, complaining of maybe vague physical complaints, being overly obsessive with social media, or maybe looking for bullying as well. And the best thing parents can do is to just have a conversation with their children openly and express unconditional love and support regardless of what the child is experiencing emotionally.
And be okay with asking them directly. Mm-hmm. You're not going to know unless you ask. Mm-hmm. That's really important. And then to be quick about getting them some extra help, because some of the issues might be with parents.
Right.
So we want to make sure they have some independent source, and also know that may take some time. But going to a therapist is a way of finding a different mirror to you. Right. Because at that moment when you're feeling so depressed, your internal mechanism thinks that you are bad, lonely, negative self-talk, as Paige has talked about, and they need a different mirror to reflect a different positive image of themselves that they can gain and live through.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. Great conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Rick Spencer, Dr. Paige Spencer, father-daughter psychologists. We appreciate them spending some time with us. By the way, you can see this conversation and many more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations, as well as on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by Gulf Power, a Southern company, and by viewers like you. Thank you.